Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the Presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Andrew Jackson, and the focus is Path to the Presidency. The year is 1824, and it is a presidential election year. James Monroe's 2 terms in office coming to an end, and there is a wide open field, the most wide open contest to date in American presidential history, in part because that two-party system that has dominated the American political system really through most of its history has gone by the wayside for this brief period of time in the 1820s, and there are 5 legitimate candidates going for Monroe's replacement. 3 of them came from Monroe's cabinet. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, Secretary of War John Calhoun, Treasury Secretary William Crawford were all in the running, along with Henry Clay, who was the Speaker of the House out of Kentucky, and then this wild card, this former Major General in the U.S. Army, the hero of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson, was increasingly being mentioned as a viable candidate for President of the United States. Jackson responded this way: "I really hope that you don't think that I'm damn fool enough to believe that. No, sir, I may be pretty well satisfied with myself in some things, but am not vain enough for that." That was his initial take. There was also somebody very close to Jackson who didn't want him to be involved in this, and that was his wife, Rachel. She said, "I do hope they will leave Mr. Jackson alone. He is not a well man and never will be unless they allow him to rest. He has done his share for the country." And in fact, Jackson was not a well man. He had gastrointestinal problems. He was emaciated. His diet was poor. He would go back and forth these bouts of diarrhea and constipation, oftentimes in bed for days on end. And his wife, at least, just wanted him to retire and rest and be home with his family. Well, that's not what the country had in mind, at least portions of it, beginning with his own state of Tennessee. Very popular was Andrew Jackson, and a state legislator put his name forward early as the state's candidate for President of the United States, and Jackson was starting to realize this could really happen, so he put out a statement. Jackson said, "The voice of the people, I am told, would bring me to the presidential chair, and it is probable some of the legislatures may bring my name before the public. I have long since determined to be perfectly silent. I never have been a candidate for office. I never will be. The people have a right to call for any man's services in a Republican government, and when they do, it is the duty of the individual to yield his services to that call." Jackson was the man of the people, and if they wanted to bring him into office, he would serve. He wasn't going to campaign for the job, didn't say he wanted the job, but he would serve if called. Well, in the meantime, he answered the call for another position. Perhaps his friends were trying to position him for national office, and so they placed him back in the U.S. Senate, a position he had had at the very early part of his career, and he hated it. Frankly, he hated it again, but he accepted the position, perhaps again trying to position himself for something else, and so he left for Washington, where he wrote his wife a number of times telling him how miserable he was in this legislative nightmare that he was settled upon, but nevertheless he accepted the position while the election campaigns continued. Well, one person dropped out. John Calhoun was the youngest of the bunch, and he vied for the vice presidency, regardless of who won the presidency. He thought maybe he could run for president later. But 4 men were in the running when the votes finally came due, despite the fact that Treasury Secretary Crawford suffered a debilitating stroke. He refused to bow out of the race. He thought he could recover in time, and sure enough, he got a bunch of electoral votes. When the votes were finally counted in the Electoral College, Jackson was on top. 99 electoral votes. He had won 12 states to John Quincy Adams' 7. Adams had some of the bigger states, so he came in second with 84 electoral votes, and it was a really close finish for third. Crawford, stroke and all, came in with 41, Henry Clay at 37. Nobody had a majority, not surprising given the number of people in the race, so the result would be decided in the U.S. House of Representatives per the Constitution. That last part between Crawford and Clay, though, is really important because the 12th Amendment to the Constitution said if nobody gets a majority in the Electoral College, only the top 3 vote-getters go to the House for the final decision. And because Clay, who got more popular votes than Crawford, fell short of him in the Electoral College, Clay was out. This mattered a lot because Clay was Speaker of the House. He was very popular in the House of Representatives. If he had squeaked into the number 3 spot, he might have been elected president from his colleagues in the House. Instead, he would have potentially the role of kingmaker, because all three viable candidates left in the running knew that Clay had a lot of influence in the House of Representatives. There were some entreaties whether or not who Clay was going to support. And some of this came to a head in a meeting that Clay asked for with John Quincy Adams. And they met at Adams' house January 6th, a month before the vote in the House was going to take place. It was a one-on-one meeting. Nobody else was in the room. Adams captured in his diary, and Adams was the most noted diarist in American presidential history. He captured everything about his life, his opinions, facts for years, and he wrote about this meeting, in which he said he, Clay, wished me, as far as I think proper, to satisfy him with regard to some principles of great public importance, but without any personal consideration for himself. In the question to come before the House between General Jackson, Mr. Crawford, and myself, he had no hesitation in saying that his preference would be for me. This should not have been a surprise. Clay hated Jackson. Jackson hated Clay. It goes back to those days when Clay wanted to censure Jackson for his role in the Seminole War, taking the fight illegally and unconstitutionally in his mind against the Spanish. They had completely different views on policy. Clay was never going to support Andrew Jackson. He and Adams were much closer on policy matters, aligned to Clay's American system of internal improvements and high protective tariffs, this America First mentality through some of these economic policies. Quincy Adams and Clay were very much aligned. So it was not going to be a surprise that Clay, in fact, would support Adams and not Jackson. Nevertheless, that meeting was fodder for all kinds of angst and conspiracy theories about what kind of agreements were put in place. A newspaper, the Columbian Observer, started to cry foul that Clay was going to get a quid pro quo deal to become Secretary of State in return for his support in the House of Representatives. Well, that was all the noise when February 9th they came together in the House to vote, each state with one vote, and Quincy Adams won the presidency on the first ballot by one. He picked up 13 states. Jackson had 7, Crawford had 4. 5 states that had originally gone for someone else switched to Adams, including 3 that had originally gone for Clay. Shortly thereafter, President-elect Adams named Clay his Secretary of State, and Jackson and his supporters cried foul, and they never relented. They coined the term the corrupt bargain, and they went after Adams, they went after Clay, over and over. Corrupt bargain, corrupt bargain. It was incessant. Jackson completely blamed both. He was caught up in the emotions of the moment. He said about Clay, "So you see the Judas of the West has closed the contract and will receive the 30 pieces of silver. His end will be the same. Was there ever witnessed such a barefaced corruption in any country before?" This was Jackson's mood around the corrupt bargain. It doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. Again, Clay was never going to support Jackson. Him supporting Adams was not a surprise. The fact that he was the most viable candidate to be Secretary of State certainly was coincidental to all of this, but a quid pro quo deal, there's really no evidence of that. It didn't matter to Jackson. It didn't matter to Jackson's supporters. They were rabidly supporting their man, and if he said corrupt bargain, they were more than ready to go along. Well, this had a long tail. First of all, it was a complete cloud over the Adams administration, who had his own problems that we've talked about in previous episodes, but basically nothing got done, in part because Jackson's supporters, because of this so-called corrupt bargain, were so much against the administration that stymied a lot of the things that Adams wanted to do. What did Jackson do? Well, first of all, he resigned from his seat in the Senate. He never wanted to be there, headed back to Tennessee, where his friends formed what they informally called the Nashville Central Committee, where they started planning his election campaign almost from the day the ballots were done in the House of Representatives in 1825, looking forward to the future. He had his friends, military colleagues, and a couple of other key elements. Jackson's supporters included Duff from the U.S. Telegraph, a press organ that just hounded the Adams administration the entire 4 years he was in office, promoting Jackson all the same. And Senator Martin Van Buren, who had supported Crawford in the 24 election, now he was all in with Jackson. And Van Buren was a bit of a master at politics, and he was a key element of planning this future campaign for Jackson and then executing it. It was a nasty campaign. Corrupt bargain on the one side. Well, while President Adams was silent, his supporters were equally negative, painting a very negative light about sort of this out-of-control military dictator, Andrew Jackson, terrible judgment, uncontrollable rage. He was a serial duelist, and those charges from way back when that he had married another man's wife, which we had covered a previous episode. Well, Duff Green was also incessant about the corrupt bargain leading up to the election of 1828, and he said in his U.S. Telegraph that he had proof of it. A congressman, according to him, had been dispatched by Henry Clay to all three camps to see if anyone would give him a deal. Secretary of State in return for his influence on the vote in the House of Representatives. Jackson, according to this congressman, had said no and rebuffed it. Apparently, Quincy Adams had said yes. Well, the problem was when this congressman, who was Senator James Buchanan, the future president, when he was named, Buchanan came out and said no. That is not what happened. Buchanan said, had I ever known or even suspected that General Jackson believed I had been sent to him by Mr. Clay or his friends, I should immediately have corrected his erroneous impression and thus prevented the necessity for this unpleasant explanation. That was not an easy thing for Buchanan to do, but he at least tried to set the record straight, but it didn't matter. Jackson's supporters were absolutely convinced of the propaganda around the nefarious corrupt bargain, that they were all in supportive of Jackson, really no matter what anybody else said. They believed him, that was enough, and they were going to bring him to the presidency. Well, democracy at this time was expanding. From the 1824 to the 1828 election, a lot of the states, particularly in the West, started giving the right to the franchise to a lot more people. Now, not to blacks, not to women, but to white males. Particularly in the West, the expansion of the ballot started to have a bigger influence in the popular vote in 1828. That popular vote tripled from the previous election, with now more than 1 million people getting a chance to vote. You had states like Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee on the western side of the country. They had more popular votes than some of the older states like Virginia and Massachusetts. So this element of democracy expanding really started to kick in a lot with this election in 1828. What were the results? Well, it wasn't a big surprise. Jackson won in a landslide. He more than doubled Adams in the Electoral College, 178 to 83. He captured 56% of the popular vote. The people had spoken. They put their man in the White House. Well, there was only one person who wasn't going to be going with him, and that was his wife, Rachel. 1 month after the election was decided, Rachel Jackson suffered an attack and she never recovered. She died December 22nd, 1828. Absolutely crushing blow to Andrew Jackson. She had been his rock for more than 30 years. He went into deep mourning. He said, "Oh, how fluctuating are all earthly things. At the time I least expected it and could least spare her. She was snatched from me, and I left here a solitary monument of grief without the least hope of happiness here below." An incredibly tough time for Jackson, who wasn't content that she had just died. He saw villainy in most things, including this. He blamed his political opponents for the attacks on Jackson and his wife about their marriage during the campaign. He saw a direct line from that to her attack and her death. At the time of her burial, Jackson said she was murdered by slanderers that pierced her heart. May God Almighty forgive her murderers, as I know she forgave them. I never can. Jackson was often looking for a villain, and he had this chip on his shoulder as he headed to Washington. He headed to Washington to take on the highest office in the land at one of the lowest points in his life, but those are stories for another day. That is Andrew Jackson and his path to the presidency from the life of Andrew Jackson. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.